Hello everybody, thanks for coming. Welcome to Science on Tap. We're going to get started tonight. I see a lot of new faces, so I'll go ahead and give you a small introduction as to what we're going to be doing tonight. The idea of Science on Tap is to sort of have a real laid-back atmosphere where folks can talk about their science that they do here in the Valley, and in a way that's really approachable. So the name of the game is real relaxed and real easygoing, and please enjoy our talk tonight. What we'll end up doing is having a small presentation and then a Q&A session, and after that we'll just kind of hang out and you can ask questions of our speaker or any of the other folks that are here. We encourage conversation and to sort of mull over what we've learned about tonight. There's a couple sort of housekeeping things to mention. The brewery has been really gracious, and for every pint that we sell tonight, they will donate $1 for the Flathead Lakers and the biological station to split. So what we're doing is drinking for a fundraiser here tonight. So I encourage drink up. I hope you're thirsty. There you go. Before I introduce our speaker, there's a couple little things I'd like to mention. Greg, you want to come up? We have a special guest this evening who is not our speaker, not to take the spotlight away, but we'd like to make a quick introduction, so here's Greg.
And it's not me. I'm Greg McCormick. I'm the president of the Flathead Lakers, and a couple of thank yous that I'd like to give out to the Flathead Lake Brewing Company for their generous hosting of these events. To Sean Devlin, postdoc researcher at the Flathead Lake Biological Station, for helping his wife, Hillary Devlin, who is the education and outreach coordinator for the Flathead Lakers, come up with topics and to organize this. But the special guest that's in the house tonight is the new director of the Flathead Lake Biological Station. It's Jim Elzer. And I think it's a great sign when on the first day on the job, in other words, they're moving in today, he's out here drinking beer with the locals. So we have a good hand for Jim Elzer. And there are a couple other people here in the audience that are Flathead Laker representative board members. If you just raise your hands, and the executive director of the Lakers is with us tonight. If you have any questions about what the Lakers do, or if you'd like to join us and help us do what we do, catch us. Yeah, while we're here. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Greg, and welcome, Jim. Thanks for coming. So we, I guess I should plug the bio station as well now that Greg's introduced the Lakers. So if you're wanting to join up with the Lakers, feel free. But we also would like to talk to you about things you can do to help the bio station as well if you're interested. So grab any one of us bio station folks. Want to raise your hands really quick? A couple in the back there. I think there's other folks out in the barrel room because they came too late and they wanted to give good seats to you folks. So I think they'll be pretty easy to spot actually. So just you can ask me if you have any questions about what the bio station does, and ask my wife Hillary about the Lakers if you have any questions. All right, so on to the good stuff. Tonight we have a really good presentation plan. Leo, come on up. Tonight we have Leo Rosenthal, who is a fisheries biologist with FWP, and he's going to be talking about something that I think is really, really interesting, and that's what's going on in Swan Lake. So the first thing I'd like to do is give Leo a poster as a token of our appreciation. So if you folks haven't seen the Flathead Lake maps, Tom Bansack is sitting out front here, and he has them for sale. Each one is $20. They're really, really nice. I encourage you, if you don't have one yet, to go ahead and get one. And that's just a small token. So without further ado, I'll hand the mic over, and please welcome Leo.
Thanks for having me out. I'm Leo Rosenthal. I'm the area fisheries management biologist for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. My area covers the swan drainage, which we'll be talking about tonight, and also the south and middle forks of the Flathead. So a nice big area of Montana with lots of different fisheries issues. I've been up here in the area since 2007. I've been with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks since 2004. native of Butte, Montana. Got my undergraduate degree from University of Montana and my master's degree from Montana State University. So a little conflicted there, but I still cheer for the Grizz. So they asked me to come in tonight and talk about a few different things. Swan Lake, as far as the lake trout project that we've been working on since 2009, and then also about the recent walleye introduction. So we'll finish up with some of that tonight as well. So lake trout in Swan Lake has been a big topic, and we've been working on this project since about 2009. But it's not just Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And so...
we really can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Loud enough.
All right, how about that? Is that better? So it's not just Fish, Wildlife, and Parks that's working on this. We've been carrying this project out through the Swan Valley Bull Trout Working Group, and it's made up of these different agencies here. And so while Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is the lead on these types of projects, we can't do it alone. And so we've got a lot of partnerships as far as funding goes, and as far as the manpower to do these types of projects. So Swan Lake, most of you should know where it's at. We're here in Bayport, but it's one of the largest tributaries of Flathead Lake. It's also been home to one of our most stable and healthy bull trout populations, so much so that in 1998, when bull trout were listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, Swan Lake was the only water body left in Montana that anglers were allowed to still fish for bull trout. And in fact, the regulation at the time was one daily and one in possession, which very liberal regulations indicating that we have very, very strong bull trout populations in Swan Lake. And that continues today, where anglers can still do catch and release for bull trout. But a lot of that changed in 1998, coincidentally the same year that bull trout were listed, when lake trout were first documented in the Swan drainage. So in 1998, an angler caught the first lake trout. It was actually upstream of Swan Lake, in the Swan River itself, near where Woodward Creek comes in, so quite a ways up. And that caused quite a bit of alarm. Lake trout we've known for years had some sort of an effect on native fish populations and flathead drainage. But we thought that the Swan was secure, but then it was quite a surprise when they showed up in '98. From 1998 until 2003, more anglers started reporting that they were catching lake trout in Swan Lake as well as in the Swan River. But it wasn't until 2003 that they started showing up in Fish, Wildlife, and Parks as routine monitoring. And so this was our first indication that the lake trout population was reproducing, and that this was potentially a bigger problem than we had initially thought it was going to be. From 2003 until 2005, lake trout catch from both anglers as well as from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in our monitoring continued to increase. And so then we continue to know this population is increasing, and we need to start being more concerned about what kind of impacts it was going to have on the rest of the fisheries. So in 2005, we formed the Swan Valley Bull Trout Working Group, which again was made up of those 6 different agencies. This group kind of came together with mutual interests. Everybody was interested and concerned about bull trout in the Swan, and were there ways that we could start getting our minds together and thinking about ways that we might reduce the lake trout population to benefit bull trout and kokanee on the Swan. And this group concluded that if left unchecked, that lake trout would eventually dominate the Swan Lake fishery system. And this is not unique to Swan. This is something that we see, commonly in different Canadian lakes. Whitefish Lake up north is a good example of this. Flathead Lake would be real similar. Glacier Park, Idaho Lakes, and essentially what it comes down to is when you have this same cast of characters, being lake trout, bull trout, kokanee, and mysis shrimp, typically through a series of different interactions, it works out really poorly for kokanee and then eventually for bull trout. And so this is a common theme that we've seen throughout much of the West. So what have we done so far? So again, lake trout were first documented in 1998, started to increase in the catch and in our monitoring. 2006 comes along in the Swan Valley Bull Trout Working Group. We said, okay, we need to know more about this lake trout population. And so we brought on a graduate student, Ben Cox, was from Montana State University. And he started in 2006 and finished up in about 2008, looking at lake trout population demographics and what some possible suppression scenarios would look like and how much effort we would have to be putting into it if we wanted to do something about the lake trout. So that all led up to 2009, and that's when we embarked on this experimental suppression project that we'll talk about tonight. So I always like to kind of start off when you talk about lake trout suppression is why would we even entertain something like that? Why is this something that's important? Well, first and foremost, that lake trout threaten the bull trout population. Again, this bull trout population in the Swan is historically one of the most robust that we had in Montana, and not just in Montana. That goes for the lower 48. You know, I mean, this is home of the bull trout here, and this is some of the last of the best. So lake trout threaten the bull trout population, and that's a no. But also, you know, gill netting is being explored as a suppression alternative in a lot of different systems. Everything from something like Quartz Lake on the left there, up in Glacier National Park, very, small lake, 869 surface acres, all the way up to things as big as Flathead Lake, 125,000 surface acres. So some other ones that you probably hear about are Yellowstone Lake and Lake Ponderay, but both of those are very large lakes. And so Swan, it's interesting that the laser doesn't show up on the TV there. Swan is somewhere down in this kind of medium-sized, almost on the smaller size compared to these other ones. But really what it comes down to is this is an experiment, what we've been doing since '09. This is an experiment to determine the feasibility of using gill nets to reduce lake trout to benefit other fish species. So can you remove enough lake trout and not have enough other fish in the bycatch to benefit fish species like kokanee and bull trout? So again, Swan Lake, I would call it kind of medium-sized compared to the rest of those lakes that are out there. It's about 3,200 surface acres, but more importantly, not all of it is good lake trout habitat. So Swan Lake has two real deep basins, one down on the south end and one up on the north end there. And Swan Lake stratifies during the late summer at about 60 feet. And so that's important because those two dark parts of the lake that you see up there, those are the only parts of the lake that are greater than 60 or 70 feet in depth. And so in those two basins of the lake are where the warm water is on the top and the cold water is down on the bottom, and the juvenile lake trout concentrate in those areas where there's colder water in the deeper areas. So that's important because those are the areas where we net for the juvenile lake trout. So when we go about doing things like lake trout suppression, obviously there's a fair bit of public involvement that goes on with doing a project like this where we're going to be killing fish. We did an initial environmental assessment in 2009 when we started the project, and that was for a 3-year period so that we could see if it was even feasible to start removing lake trout. So from 2009 to 2012, we worked on that and found out that we had a pretty good program going and that it was feasible to remove these lake trout, and that we were exhibiting a certain level of mortality on the lake trout population. But what we didn't see was we needed more time to see how the lake trout population responds to that level of exploitation, as well as looking to see at how the other fish species respond, namely kokanee and bull trout. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? We want to improve things for kokanee and bull trout, so we needed more time to see how those fish populations would respond. So in 2012, we went back out to the public and said, okay, we need a 5-year extension on this to see more time and see more of a response in those fish. When we put it back out to the public, you need public support to do these kinds of projects. The two big concerns came up during that process, and those two things were bycatch of other fish species, namely bull trout, and then the operational costs of the project. So those are things that we identified in the EA and tried to address to our best abilities. In the original EA, when we put it out, we didn't want to just go out and start netting. And go out and net and not have any way to evaluate our effectiveness. And so in the initial EA, we put in some evaluation criteria to try our best to determine if this was a successful project or not. The first criteria for that was whether or not we could inflict a total lake trout. More about how this project works, it's 2 phases. First one we call juvenile netting, because we're trying to remove juvenile lake trout. We're using small mesh gill nets to capture mostly H2 through 4 lake trout. It's 3 weeks of netting with 30 lifts, and a lift is defined as any time that we set the nets out and then retrieve the nets. During this portion of the netting, all of the fish that we catch are cleaned and packed on ice and sent to local area food banks. The second phase of the netting is called spawner netting, where we're netting the large spawning individuals. So these nets are settled on predetermined spawning areas. Again, 3 weeks of netting, 5 days a week with 24 lifts total. We did the initial part of that netting from 2009 to 14 was done along the highway road cut that was identified by that graduate student. 2015 and 14, we identified some new areas from some new telemetry, so I'll talk about that in a bit. So here's what we've seen. We really don't see much difference from all of those years. Effort during the juvenile netting has been similar for all of the years. The mesh array has been consistent since 2012. The data that you see on the left is total numbers of fish removed, and the data on the right that you see is actually catch per unit effort, so a little bit standardized look at it. And what you see is no significant differences from 2012 to 2015, indicating that what we're doing, we're not seeing the population increasing, but we're not seeing that population of lake trout decreasing either. We're basically capping it off and kind of cutting it off at the top. For the spawner netting, kind of see the same thing. The red bars indicate those areas of the traditional highway road cut, and the blue bars are those new areas that we identified in 14 and 15. On the right is catch per unit effort, so again standardized by effort, and we again see no trend or any significant differences between years. But what we have seen is that we are able to affect the age distribution of these fish. So this looks like a bunch of spaghetti, but what it is this is percent of the catch. And what you see is that in that light blue is 2009. When we first started netting that traditional area, many of the fish, a high percentage of them, were these larger, older individuals. And as we've removed them from the population, now what we see is the bulk of the catch are these 500 to 600 millimeter fish, which are fish that have recently reached sexual maturity and are now showing up on the spawning area for the first time. And we see that again on these new areas that we've identified through more telemetry. So again, the blue line is 2009, basically an unexploited area, and the black would be after many years of netting on the same area, shifting back to those fish that are newly sexual mature fish. And then that green line is the new area that we identified in 2014, again unexploited. And then the red area is after 1 year of netting, we've removed many of the larger, older individuals. So again, our ability to affect the age distribution of the fish. So bycatch, as I mentioned, is a big deal. You don't want to hurt the fish that you're trying to help. All of the bull trout that come into the boat, we try to release them as soon as we can. But ultimately, about 40% of the ones that we catch die. The ones that we release, we know that they don't all just live, so through a bunch of data that we've collected, we estimate another 13% of the ones that we release do die. And so I think it's a fairly fair and transparent estimate, about 53% mortality. Despite all of the things that we do out there to try and avoid it, bull trout bycatch still makes up a portion of the catch, but it's only about 4%, which is relatively low. The big question for me is we know that this amount of effort hasn't been enough to crash the lake trout, so if we did more, what kind of an effect would that have on bull trout bycatch? This figure just shows that, many of the things that I hear is that we're netting out there and we're catching everything, and that's just not true, This is percent of the catch, and you can see here that every year, 80 to 90% of our catch is made up of lake trout, and the rest of our catch is made up of a mix of bull trout, kokanee, native suckers, and northern pikemen. So what have bull trout done since we started doing this? I showed up here in 2007, just in time to watch the bull trout population take a dive in the Swan. Some of that is probably related to our netting, but a large portion of it's related to lake trout being present in the lake as well. But nonetheless, over the last 6 years, bull trout numbers seem to have stabilized a bit, as you can see in the red count graph there on the left. But they've stabilized at a level that's about 40% less than the long-term average, which is quite alarming. To add to that, the bycatch of small juvenile bull trout has been declining in recent years as well. And so I think that we're starting to see some of these total effects from the lake trout population in Swan Lake. But the big question again is we know that we kill some of these fish through the bycatch, and we're hoping to get benefits from reduced lake trout population, but how much benefit will the gill netting give us? Will it be enough to offset that bycatch? You know, these are some of the questions that we still have to answer. At the same time, kokanee here make up a big chunk of the food base for bull trout as well as lake trout. Kokanee bycatch was also down in 2015. We also monitor kokanee through red counts along a shoreline on Swan Lake, and they were down this last year too. So, you know, we do have some concerns in upcoming years that maybe our kokanee are starting to crash out there as a result of lake trout being in the system now for 20 years. So we also monitor mysis. Mysis make up the food base for a lot of the different fish that are in there. We sample two different areas once a year, so it's kind of a snapshot. And there's really no trend in that data. It's really variable. You know, some years are higher than others and lower than others, but if I had to describe that, I would just call it flat. So a bit of an overview. From 2009 to 15, we've removed about 55,000 lake trout from Swan Lake. Bycatch continues to be relatively low, although obviously it's a concern. We don't want to catch anything that we're not trying to. The identification of those additional spawning areas has increased our adult catch and increased our knowledge about where these fish are spawning and the ability for them to adapt to our netting. Bull trout appear to have stabilized at these lower levels, although we do have some concerns about kokanee. It looks like kokanee are declining in the Swan. And then 2016 will be the last year of this current project. So this project, again, was an experiment to determine the feasibility of our netting. And so how we move forward with this will obviously involve a lot of discussion within our working group. And it'll depend on a lot of things on how we move forward. So, you know, we have to all be able to agree on the science, and that's why we've done a good job of collecting data over the years and making sure that we have good standardized comparable data from one year to the next. The other thing that obviously comes into play is money. You know, these projects, they're not cheap. And in the case of Swan's one of the cheaper ones that we see out there. In the world of lake trout suppression, you know, some of these projects, in the case of Yellowstone Lake, they spend, you know, just over $2 million a year on lake trout suppression. Swan Lake, we've been fortunate that we're carrying it out through this interagency working group. Everybody kind of chips in, and we beg and borrow. Trout Unlimited's been great about donating volunteers to come out and help clean fish. So, you know, we're really scraping it together, but nonetheless, the project is probably about $150,000 a year in its current configuration. And so if we want to do more, you can imagine that it's going to cost more. And then, of course, the third thing is public involvement. You know, is this socially palatable? Do people like this? Is this a good idea? All three of these things need to be factored in to any decision that we're going to have as far as moving forward with more lake trout suppression in Swan Lake. So we're working this through as a working group right now. We have one more year of the project, and you know, I'm hopeful that we'll come together with some sort of solution for 2017. So the last thing that people have been interested in is walleye. So through this lake trout suppression project, we're out there this fall and we're netting for spawning lake trout, and sure enough, the nets are coming in, and the boat captain looks over at me, and they're from the Great Lakes, they're from Wisconsin, they know what walleye look like. They says, hey, there's a walleye coming in. And I said, yeah, whatever, there's no walleye in Swan Lake. And sure enough, it was a walleye that came in. And then another week went by, and another walleye came in. And so we thought, geez, this is kind of weird. And of course, illegal introductions are rampant throughout northwestern Montana. This walleye are a newcomer to Swan Lake, but everywhere else in the valley, every time you turn around, we're finding smallmouth bass or black crappie or yellow perch. People seem to be spreading illegal, non-native fish all over the valley. So this was a big concern. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks just recently had a new administrative rule that came into play, and that was good timing because it set into motion many of the things that we did. So these two walleye were caught during the spawner netting this last fall. Both fish were 17 and 17 and a half inches apiece. That both fish were in good condition, so again, fat relative to their length. Both were immature males, non-spawning males. So from those fish, we took every type of tissue sample that we could. Took otoliths, scales, genetics. We submitted both of those fish to enforcement for evidence in hopes that they'll eventually be able to make some sort of a case on potentially who dumped these fish into Swan Lake. And again, that arm rule gave us some guidance on how we need to move forward with this illegal introduction. So that arm rule went into effect this last year. And what it does is it gives you kind of a framework for dealing with this. And so one of the first things you need to do is determine the validity of a report. Well, the validity was pretty good considering that I was out there when this fish came in. So we knew that was pretty clear. And the next thing to determine was whether or not this fish species was established in Swan Lake. That was a big question that came up. Are these two fish that we caught, were they born in Swan Lake, or were these fish part of the two that somebody potentially dumped in Swan Lake? And that's a big difference. One is maybe it's not time to be too alarmed yet, and the other one is wow, we've got a reproducing population in there. So that was the first thing we wanted to look at. And so coincidentally, at the same time, we had a guy that we just hired in our office, Sam Beret, is a new biologist. And he got his master's degree studying otolith microchemistry in Pacific salmon. And he was a great resource to have because he said, yeah, we can do this with the otoliths from the walleye. And so, for those of you that don't know what an otolith is, inside of a fish's head are two small bony structures. And people refer to them as a fish's ear bone. But it's a very small bone that's on either side of its brain that's encased in kind of some fluid, and it's used for a bunch of different things, and sound probably is one of them. Maintaining its position in the water is probably one of them. But what's neat about otoliths are they're made up of bone, and they're created at the same time that the fish is born. And so when the fish is born, the same microchemical components of the water that the fish was born in are laid down in the calcium inside of that fish's otolith. And so when you get the otolith, and this is what it looks like, it's a three-dimensional object. It's like a snowball or a Tootsie Pop. And you need to take this otolith and put it on a slide and sand it down very, very carefully until you expose the chocolatey center of the Tootsie Pop. And inside that chocolatey center is the material that was laid down when the fish was born. So then you can take that sample, once it's prepped, and send it to, there's only a few labs in the country where they have this, but in this case it was Woods Hole in Massachusetts, and they can take a laser ablation machine and sample across the entire otolith from edge to edge, and that material gets sucked into a mass spectrometer. This is technical, I didn't do it, somebody else did. And they give you the microchemical analysis from one end to the other, including the core. And so we sent off lake trout that we knew were born in Swan Lake, so we knew what their core was going to look like, and then the walleye that we caught in Swan Lake, and we compared those, and sure enough, these two walleye were not born in Swan Lake. They were born somewhere else. We don't know where, but somewhere else. And so, that was important, and we'll see as more walleye, if they do get turned in, or if we sample more, if there is a reproducing population. But currently, with the knowledge that we have, there is not a reproducing population of walleye in Swan Lake. Other things that we did immediately with that arm rule, it allowed us to put into effect an emergency regulation that required any walleye that people catch in Swan Lake, that they have to kill them and they have to turn them into us. And that's because for two different reasons. One, I want those fish. I want tissue samples from them. I want otolith samples from them. And the other thing, and even more important, is this is an illegal introduction, and we don't want to benefit or reward people for doing these types of things. You know, the consequences for putting walleye into these water bodies is, you know, it's unknown, but it can't be good, and so we don't want to reward people for that. So it's a disincentive with this regulation that people can't keep these fish and that they have to turn them in. And then the third thing was a lot of different groups came together, and the reward is now up to $30,000. And surprisingly, we don't have a whole lot of leads on who would have dumped these fish in there. You would think with $30,000 on the line, you know, somebody would turn someone in, or somebody would know something. But yet we still don't have any leads on who it was. So I guess with that, I don't really have anything else, but I'd open it up for questions.
Slot.
What's that?
Why did you do a slot?
The question was a slot limit? Yeah, so we don't have a slot limit on Swan Lake. Swan Lake, there is a daily limit for lake trout, and that's 10 fish daily. And that's mostly because for most of the people that I talk to, the anglers, can't catch 10 lake trout out of Swan Lake. And we didn't want them to confuse them with bull trout. People have a very hard time telling the difference between bull and lake trout, and so we didn't want people to just have no holds barred and be killing bull trout inadvertently. But we don't have a slot limit on Swan Lake.
What sort of data do you guys have on brook trout, bull trout hybrids?
The question was what kind of data do we have on bull-brook hybrids in the Swan? And it's very anecdotal, and it's so we see bull-brook hybrids when we do stream electrofishing for juvenile bull trout in the tributaries. I see the bull-brook hybrids there. I see them when I do the Swan River electrofishing, and then we even catch them in the nets in the lake. So, you know, we know that there's hybridization going on between bull trout and brook trout, but as far as any kind of long-term data on it, we don't really have any.
Where have you got cases of success in control of bull lake trout?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question was, where has there been cases of success with lake trout suppression? And the one case that's being touted out there as being successful is Lake Pend Oreille. So Idaho Fish and Game started lake trout suppression in Pend Oreille sometime in the late 90s. I think it was like 98, maybe 2000. And they've been removing lake trout for quite a few years now, and they're seeing their kokanee population rebound to the point in which they had closed their kokanee fishing for a number of years and now have reopened it with fairly liberal regulations. And so they're touting that as a success story for reducing lake trout and seeing a response in kokanee. Now what they haven't seen at the same time is a dramatic response in bull trout. And so, depending on what your objectives are, you know, the definition of success can get clouded a little bit. But they're touting that one nonetheless. Idaho touts that as being successful. Glacier National Park with Quartz Lake is saying that they're being successful with it. But it's the numbers of success stories with gillnetting suppression are very limited.
In a lot of national parks, they don't, like you said, they're trying to do something about the lake trout in Yellowstone Lake and Quartz Lake. They allow that, the national parks, because they don't allow anything. You know, you can't even cut a tree. You can't even pick up a twig to put in your campfire. And how do they allow getting rid of lake trout?
So the question was, is in the park, how do they allow for something like lake trout suppression? And so that one, you're right, things working in the park is very challenging.
Yeah.
But in the case of lake trout, let's use Yellowstone first. In the case of Yellowstone, they're doing it to preserve Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And so Yellowstone cutthroat trout in Yellowstone Lake and in the park there they'd be akin to like the Pacific salmon in Alaska. And so for years, many of the other animals in Yellowstone Park, grizzly bears, eagles, all of these other animals out there, they depend to some degree on Yellowstone cutthroat trout that would come out in thousands and thousands and thousands of these fish. Many of you probably have seen this in the day, and go up into the upper Yellowstone River and into those tributaries, and then grizzly bears would feed on it. And so they're looking at it as more of an ecosystem kind of an approach. And in the case of Yellowstone, it's our first national park, and the current superintendent there, Wink, has made it one of the highest priorities for the Park Service, and so he's fully behind it. Now, in the case of the glacier, the same kind of deal. So bull trout in those lakes like Quartz Lake and Logging Lake and these ones that they're proposing doing this in the park, many of those were bull trout populations that were impacted by lake trout that came up from Flathead Lake during the big boom. And so, again, ecosystem function-wise, they're trying to hold on to bull trout in the park, and so they've raised it to this level of importance where they can do this type of project.
I caught a lake trout in Upper Tumet. I mean, I didn't even know what it was. I'm holding it up going, looking at him going, what do you think this is? They doing, they're, Upper Tumet's way up there.
Right, yeah. So lake trout, when they took off in Flathead Lake, they went everywhere, and they pioneered up into the park. They came up into Swan. So my predecessor, Scott Rumsey, was in this position for 30 years. He witnessed when lake trout were really taking off in Flathead. And of course we know Big Fork Dam had a fish ladder on it. So Big Fork Dam was created in 1910. And it had a fish ladder that was pretty marginal, but nonetheless it was there. It was installed in the 1950s, early 1950s. And for years and years we thought, well, it's not working very well, but here it was a structure that was designed to pass fish. So Scott went up and he actually welded it shut or welded something on it so the fish couldn't pass it. And that was in 1992. And we thought, it's a good thing we did that because lake trout hadn't made it into the Swan. And then sure enough, 6 years later, we find them in the Swan. So the damage had already been done, and Scott just didn't know it. So same with the Tumet, and same with any of these other kinds of areas in the park. Lake trout have the ability to make their way into many of these systems.
So how does the lake trout do against the walleye?
That's a really good question. The question was, how do lake trout and walleye do together?
Well, the Great Lakes people should know that.
Right, and so, of course, the Great Lakes, they have both. They have lake trout and they have walleye. Their lake trout took a big hit, and some people would attribute that to the commercial fishing industry. But there was many challenges that the lake trout had in the Great Lakes. They had a significant commercial fishery, but they also had years of pollution. They had dioxins that were being dumped into the water, and then they had Pacific lamprey. So the lake trout were under a bunch of different stresses that it's hard to really tease out what was the mechanism that caused them to go down. But in many parts of the world, lake trout and walleye, live side by side.
And I believe it was in the late 70s, maybe the early 80s, the fishing game stopped lake trout in the Silver Lake, where there was a lot of bull trout and also other species, shrimps that they had stocked in. How'd that ever turn out?
You're talking about Silver Lake over by Anaconda.
That's correct.
Yeah, that's my old stomping grounds. I don't know how that ever worked out for them. The fish densities, I know that there's still bull trout in there. I talked to my counterpart that works in that part of the state, and there's still a run of bull trout that live in Silver Lake. But as to how the lake trout affected their numbers, I guess I don't really know the answer to that.
Do you have an estimate of the current bull trout population in Swan Lake?
Yeah, so the way that we, monitor the number of bull trout out there, we don't have, and the question was, do we have a population estimate for the number of bull trout that are out there? And we don't have a total population estimate. The way that we monitor bull trout is through our annual red counts. And the red counts are an index of the number of adult bull trout that are out there. So this last year, when we do basin-wide red counts, which we've done every year since 1995 in the Swan, this last year we counted just over 420 bull trout reds for the entire basin. And you can assume that that's about 90% of the spawning habitat. And the typical conversion for that is 3.2 bull trout per red, and then some will double it, but it's roughly 1,200 to 2,000 adults in the population. And then, it goes obviously quite a few more when you talk about juvenile bull trout, but about 1,200 to 2,000 adults.
I'm not really a fisherman, but I'm kind of a marketing guy, and you talk a couple of times about money and also public interest.
Yeah.
Has there ever been any question about renaming the lake trout to something more ferocious, like Godzilla?
Yeah.
It's like get some people around like getting rid of Godzilla, but when it's a lake trout and you don't really know fish, it's like, hey, it belongs in the lake, and why do you kill that one versus this one? But if it had a different name, you might be able to get some momentum behind it.
Yeah, so the question was, for those in the other room, is have we considered changing the name of lake trout to something more villainous? No, we haven't, because in other parts of the world, this is a very desirable fish species, and in the case of the Great Lakes, they're going through great pains and great efforts to try and recover their lake trout. It's always interesting, in the fisheries world, it seems like when you take a fish out of its native habitat and you put it somewhere else, it does fantastic. But in its native range, it doesn't do so good. And that's similar with brook trout on the East Coast. If you go out to the East Coast, they're doing great steps and great lengths to try and recover brook trout. And here they're like the knapweed of the fish world. We can't get rid of them. And so it's the same with lake trout. And so, there hasn't been a push to change the name because, despite what our feelings are in Swan Lake and places like Flathead Lake, this is a very desirable fish species. And we do. So when we describe them here, in this case, they are described as as an invasive fish or an exotic fish.
Is there a size or an age when lake trout cease to be successfully
That's a good question. The question was, is there a size or age in which lake trout stop to be reproductively successful? And there probably is, but we haven't done any of that kind of work in Swan. More what we've been looking at is at what age do they become reproductively, available? And what it looks like that we see there is it's as early for males as 5 to 6 years of age, and for females it's about 7 and 8.
I have had a house to grow every summer in Little Bitterroot Lake, right on the lake shore.
Yeah.
We used to go, this goes way back, in the early 1945, no, I don't know, somewhere in there. We could go out and in a few minutes even, or an hour, we'd catch our amount of kokanee. And now, this last year, the year before, we could barely catch a kokanee. So what is going on? And I know that somebody came along and dumped a bunch of stuff for smallmouth bass, and I'm wondering if this walleye is also going to, it's just virtually not happening anymore.
Yeah, so the question was about Little Bitterroot Lake. Has traditionally had terrific kokanee fishing, and in the last year or 2 years, 4 or 5 years, the kokanee fishing hasn't been very good, and at the same time we are seeing an increase in the number of smallmouth bass that are out there, and then the question was is if walleye would have any kind of an impact. So we haven't documented walleye in Little Bitterroot. There's been no indication that they've been stocked there, so hopefully that is the case. Now with smallmouth bass, they're a relatively newcomer to Little Bitterroot, and it sounds like from everything that I've heard, I don't work on Little Bitterroot, that's another guy in my office, but I do hear about it, that the number of smallmouth have been increasing out there. This year was not a good ice fishing year. The ice wasn't ever very good, and our guys typically go out to Little Bitterroot to do creel survey, and that's how we get kind of a look into the numbers of kokanee and the size of kokanee that people are catching. And so this year, obviously, we didn't get a whole lot of data because the ice wasn't ever very good. So I don't know why it would be that kokanee fishing has dropped off in there, but from the word that we hear in the office, I know there's still a handful of guys that they come in and give us annual reports, again, not this year, that they still go there and they still do okay in Little Bitterroot. But it doesn't sound like that's the case.
No, it's down, the size is down.
And the size is down
Also
too.
go up somewhere to Alberta, that area, and get some and kind of put some stuff in.
But the bass is new, and I don't think that the size lake district can compete with that.
Yeah, it's kind of yet to be seen. Yeah, right. What's that?
Bycatch or rainbow?
Yeah, good question. Bycatch in the gill netting of rainbow trout. Very, very few. So the nets that we're using for this lake trout suppression, again, for the 3 weeks of the juvenile netting that we're doing, they're only in those 2 deep parts of the lake, and they're only in areas of water that's 70 feet and greater, which isn't rainbow trout habitat. The rainbow trout occupy that upper part. Now, during the spawner netting, when we're back out there, we do catch a couple, but I'd say, I can send you my reports and they've got all of the numbers, but I think the most we've ever caught in a year is probably 5, and the average is somewhere about 3.
Do you guys do radio telemetry on rainbows in the Swan?
In the upper Swan River? We have not, and that's actually a project that I would like to get up and running because it's something that we know very little about. So,
What about the lower?
So there was a telemetry project that was done before I came here. I think it was done early 2000s on the lower river below the lake, and there's nice rainbow trout in there.
Did they show them migrating in and out of the lake?
They did not show them going in and out of the lake, but using kind of that lower part of the lake, but using that lower stretch of the river. The question was about rainbow trout in the Swan River and Swan Lake, and he asked if they were coming in and out of the lake.
Do you guys have any statistical data on the fish per mile rainbow? How many rainbows per mile are in there for Swan?
Yeah, so for years, my predecessor tried to do the rest of the state. The bread and butter of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is to go out and do river electrofishing and generate a population estimate, like you're saying, a number of fish per mile. So electrofishing in the Swan River is really, really difficult. The conductivity of the water is very, very low, which you need to have a lot of conductivity into total dissolved solids in order for the electricity to travel through the water effectively. So in the Swan, we don't have that. It's got very deep pools that you see at the log jams, and it's really, really difficult to get those kinds of estimates. And so what we do now is we do 2 passes, and we do catch per unit effort. And so we don't have an actual population estimate of a number of rainbow trout per mile. Comparatively with, before I took this job, I worked down on the big hole in the Beaver Head, and we would do brown and rainbow trout estimates down there. The Swan River is a sliver of that.
Always is.
Yeah.
I would expect from your charts that you don't expect to see much difference at the end of 2016 than the previous years. Is that correct?
Yeah, the question is based on the figures up there is, do we expect to see anything dramatically different this year that we've seen in the past? And to be honest with you, I don't. Now, I could be surprised, and I'm open to that, and that's why That's why I've committed to collecting, consistent data so it's comparable from year to year. But I don't anticipate seeing anything too dramatically different this year.
And if it ended in 2020 instead of 2016, would you expect to see any difference?
In my opinion, with the data that we have, I wouldn't expect to see it. It appears to me that the level of effort that we're putting into this is not sufficient enough to cause a decline in the number of lake trout. So I would expect to see the same kind of number where those that catch per unit effort, where those don't overlap, or they overlap every year.
But assuming you don't continue beyond this year, would you realistically expect those numbers to go back up when you stop?
Well, that's a good question, and that's some of the things that we're kind of wrestling with within the working group, is whether or not, if we do more netting, does that cause a decline in the number of lake trout that are out there, versus if we don't do any netting, what happens to the number of lake trout? Does the number go up, or are we at some sort of carrying capacity? There's a lot that goes on in fisheries, that there's compensation that these fish have, so we're most effective on a certain age category of those fish, and so we may just be removing that age and it's being backfilled by others, and the same number of lake trout would be present if we hadn't been there. But these are all questions that we need to answer and be able to look at and move forward.
Does the lake trout and walleye have an impact on rainbow and cutthroat?
That's a good question. So the question was, did lake trout and walleye have any kind of an effect on rainbow trout and cutthroat trout? So again, walleye, to my understanding of it, is not a reproducing population, and so I would say that no on the case of walleye. In the case of lake trout, it's a little bit difficult to answer, because the cutthroat fishery in the Swan Lake and Swan River upstream of it's got a lot of other challenges, from rainbow trout hybridization, brook trout, things like that. And so we haven't seen a big decline in the number of rainbow trout that are out there. But again, like I was just telling this guy over here, we don't have a very good indice on the number of rainbow trout that are out there. So in our data that we have for catch per unit effort in the river, we haven't seen a decline in the number of rainbows. But is there a decline? I mean, I guess there could be, but we haven't seen that in our data.
Yeah, so with that, I understand there's an issue with the lake trout and now the introduction of water. What about the northern pike in Swan Lake? Is that, even though that is an introduced species, has that hit a static point where it hasn't grown or exploded, despite having kind of exploded through the Swan River, which is probably why there's not many cutthroat in there?
Yeah, so the question was, what about northern pike in the Swan, and how are they affecting cutthroat trout, and have they reached any kind of a critical mass in there, or any kind of carrying capacity? So northern pike are another illegal introduction in the Swan. They showed up sometime in the 1970s. They maintain a presence in the Swan, for sure. On the lower river, downstream of the lake, parts of Swan Lake itself. In the monitor netting that we do, so I've got a series that we do in the spring that's 12 gill nets that we set at the same location, same time of year, and it's used to monitor all of the other different fish species in the lake. And we haven't seen any kind of, it's very flat, the trend for northern pike. It's not increasing, but it's not decreasing either. And are northern pike a problem? Yeah, they're a problem out there too. We know they're another predator, but they maintain kind of an area of the lake. All of Swan Lake is not very good northern pike habitat. So that area down around Spring Creek, the area there by the river mouth, that lower section of the river, northern pike do pretty well in there, but the rest of the lake they don't. And so you got to really pick and choose your battles. And when it comes to the numbers of fish that are out there, lake trout outnumber the number of pike, tenfold. And so that's where we've been focusing our attention. But are they a problem? Sure.
You mentioned one of the goals for the gill netting was greater than 50% mortality. Do you have an assessment of whether you hit that or exceeded?
Yeah, so some of the data that I didn't show, they asked me to keep it kind of light on some of the modeling and such. So we do generate from, based off of the netting that we do, we are able to generate a annual lake trout population estimate, and then we know how many fish we took out of the system. And so the exploitation or the mortality rates on those age 2 through 4 lake trout, we are exceeding 50% on those. Now on the rest of the population, again, they don't show up to spawn until they're at a minimum of age 5, but really it's 6+. And so we're looking at that, and our exploitation is maybe close to 50% on those, but it's difficult to determine. And then on those age 4 through 6 fish, we're hardly even touching those. And so if I had to answer that, I would say that we are not hitting total annual mortality in excess of 50%.
Go along with all of the big presentations of lots and lots and lots of money, depending on how much they're doing over here in Flathead Lake to get all those lake trout, or a lot of them. A lot of people walk off with thousands of dollar stuff.
Okay, so I think the question was about, are we involved with like the Derby, like MAC days?
Right.
So we don't have something like that going on Swan Lake, but when we talk about the next steps and how we're going to move forward with this project, I don't think that's out of the box. When we look at this and we talk about the numbers of fish that we're actually removing, so again, in that juvenile netting period, we're only removing 5,000 to 10,000 fish, and in the spawner netting, it's another 400 fish. And so, could we accomplish that through using anglers through some sort of a derby or a tournament like MAC Days? Yeah, I think that those options are out there. Now we haven't gone that route yet, but anything is on the table out there when we talk about how we want to move forward.
Have you had any walleye turned in by anglers yet?
We have not. The question was, have any more walleye been turned in? And we haven't had any more walleye turned in. I'd like to think that we caught the only 2 that were out there, but that's wishful thinking. And so if people catch them, hopefully they will turn them in.
Alrighty, well that was a great Q&A. I think that was one of our best yet. So I appreciate all the interest and I appreciate the questions. There's no more questions. It seems like there should be. I don't know. That was a roll right there. I like that. Let's give Leo a round of applause. That was great. Okay, so I guess at this point we usually kind of dwindle down, and if folks are heading out, we're welcome to continue the Q&A if you guys want, or can come up with more questions. And we're happy to sit and just talk. Leo will be here for another little bit, I hope. And if you have any other questions, any more personal or anything like that you want to discuss one-on-one, please do so. And I really appreciate you guys coming tonight. This has been a great turnout. Oh, question.
Next program?
The next program will be
John Wheaton and someone Rose, Montana Bureau of Mining and Geology. They're going to talk about the Kalispell Deep Aquifer.
So we'll have a completely different topic for next time. We've had bears and fish now for a couple months in a row, but we'll get into some groundwater science here and understand what's going on beneath our feet a little bit, which it's maybe not as flashy as walleye and Swan Lake, but trust me, it means more to everyone in this room than we probably understand. Do you have something to say, Greg, the way you're standing up? All righty, here we go.
I'm going to, just to point out, just last week, the Lakers were notified by DNRC, I think, or DEQ in Flathead County, that there is a proposed 750 acre-feet bottling plant proposed for the lower valley. So get ready, it's valuable stuff. 750 acre-feet a year in bottles leaving the Flathead.
I'm not sure how to follow that up. That sounds disastrous, but I guess the good note of the evening is that there's not a reproducing population of walleye in Swan Lake, and that $30,000 is still up for grabs. So if you come up with who done it, it's a profitable, spend some time, figure it out. I have my suspicions, I'll tell you that. Anyway, let's give Leo another